Welcome back to the program. Safe to say that the college basketball season has not gone the way Hubert Davis and the Carolina Tar Heels expected. For more on the year that hasn't been, our own Evan Abramson, joined by Andrew Carter from the Raleigh News and Observer. Evan?
UNC basketball not exactly at the place where they want to be. They're tied for fourth in the ACC men's basketball standings on a two-game losing streak, but they do have a shot for redemption when they take on Boston College on Saturday. And that's where we bring in our guest for tonight, Andrew Carter of the News and Observer, who's an expert on all things ACC basketball here in the Triangle. Andrew, let me first ask you this most important question. 4 years into Hubert Davis's tenure as head coach of the Tar Heels, is he on the hot seat in his respective job in Chapel Hill?
Yeah, Evan, I don't think he is at this point. I think with Hubert, you have to remember a few things. First and foremost, he's an alum. Obviously he played for Dean Smith. He worked his way up from a very lightly recruited prospect, didn't have a ton of offers out of high school. His uncle, of course, played at UNC back in the 70s, Walter Davis. He's part of that Carolina family that you hear so much about. Obviously was an assistant under Roy Williams for more than a decade. I would be stunned if they made a move after this season, regardless of what happens. You mentioned it hasn't been the season that they expected or wanted, but they were a number one seed last year in the NCAA tournament. They made the Final Four 3 years ago. They beat Duke in the national semifinal. Hubert ended Coach K's coaching career. So I think sometimes during these difficult moments, fans have to remember those things as well. Nobody loves UNC more than Hubert. I think he does have a lot to figure out. I think that coaching staff has a lot to figure out. But this is year 4. They did just get a huge commitment, recently with Caleb Wilson, one of the top prospects in the class of 25, committing to UNC over Kentucky. That's huge for Hubert and his program. And so, again, I think regardless of what happens, he gets another year. I think the criticism has been fair in a lot of ways. But, again, I would be stunned if after year 4 they made a change. Now, I think it's a fair question to ask, does Hubert want to do this? A little bit. You've seen coaches all over college basketball in recent years make a decision to get out of it because the game has changed so much. It's not really built on these ideals. I think that a lot of old school coaches try to build their programs around. Hubert, isn't that old necessarily, but I do think he sort of has a old school approach. He's committed to this Carolina way, very committed to how UNC has tried to do things forever. And so I think it's fair to question, does that align with modern day college basketball? And I would say probably not. And does that cause Hubert to maybe rethink if he wants to do this? And I think the answer is possibly. But yeah, I would be completely shocked, regardless of what happens the rest of the year, unless they just completely tank, which I don't think is in the realm for UNC to make a change.
UNC, you brought up a lot of great points. The one thing that they are not is a school that depends on money to bring in recruits to support their athletics. It was a big selling point for Bill Belichick to become the football head coach. And I asked Coach John Shire over at Duke on Thursday at his weekly availability ahead of their game against Wake Forest, if he can draw comparisons to where he and Hubert's programs are, because they started, within a year or two of each other. And you look at Duke, and they're the number 2 team in the entire country right now, UNC not having that same success. But like you said, Hubert, a different kind of player, a guy that played in the NBA from 92 to 2004 with some of the best and meanest and toughest guys in the league back then with the New York Knicks. Then you also talk about his history and his relationships to Carolina, playing at UNC from 1988 to 1992. Becoming head coach in 2021, there's not much more, like you said, that can make him more Tar Heel, more perfect for this job. But does he have the support UNC going forward? Like you said, if he wanted to continue and add more stress to his life in this new age of college coaching, or is he going to have to figure out another way to bring UNC back to the pinnacle, the top of college basketball?
Yeah, and I had this conversation a little bit with Hubert before the start of the season. I asked him, down in Charlotte at ACC Media Day, how this whole notion of the Carolina way, which of course is something that Dean Smith brought to UNC, that, the play hard, play together, play smart, that mantra. Does that, is that applicable now? How does that apply to, the current game? Hubert at that point said he thought it did. He thought, that Carolina is going to be Carolina always. He told me in that moment that UNC is not a transactional program in terms of just buying players, in terms of just offering a load of NIL money. And so I think, in those regards, UNC does have to modernize itself. You mentioned the comparison to Duke, to John Shire. And I think Shire, I think Duke, I think even under Coach K when he was there, Duke made a conscious choice and effort to modernize its program, to do things that kids these days are attracted to. Cooper Flagg, I don't think ever would have committed to UNC. Now, Cooper Flagg grew up a Duke fan. That was part of it. But let's say, a kid like that is looking at these programs and evaluating them on a lot of different points. And one of them is, am I going to be marketed? Is my brand going to be built up? Am I going to have a chance to play a ton? Am I going to be the guy? How does this program prepare me for the NBA? And I think in all those areas, fair or not, UNC is perceived to be behind the eight ball. Now, granted, Ian Jackson this year for Carolina has really stepped up. I think he's gone a long way, perhaps toward changing that narrative. The Caleb Wilson commitment is huge for Carolina to change that narrative. But if you look at the NBA these days, like Duke has a lot more stars than UNC. I mean, Jason Tatum is a huge star, a face of the NBA. I mean, who's the last NBA All-Star that UNC had? If I'm not mistaken, I think it's Vince Carter, who is older than I am. So kids nowadays, and I'm getting old. So kids nowadays, obviously they know about Michael Jordan. They've heard of Vince Carter. But a lot of these big-time players that UNC had for decades, have been out of the NBA for a long time. And those guys are sort of when I was a kid, I would hear about guys from the 50s or 60s or whatever and think man, that happened, a century ago kind of thing. And for kids nowadays, it's you look at the guys that Duke is producing, high school kid wants to be like Jason Tatum. UNC doesn't have a guy like that they can point to. And Duke has done a great job of marketing itself. And UNC fans roll their eyes at it, the brotherhood, all this stuff that people like to make fun of. But guess what? That stuff works on high school kids. They see these guys in the NBA. They see guys coming to Duke, spending a year there. They see Cooper Flagg doing his thing, and they want to be a part of that. Duke has a GM. UNC does not. I think Carolina fans would hold their nose at the thought, but they could stand to be like Duke in a lot of ways.
That's a tough statement. Andrew, thank you very much. Evan, thank you very much. Got to take our final time out. Straight ahead, we're going to talk a little NASCAR and